It's great to be in the SEC. Thank you for listening to the SEC Recap Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Warren. This is our Week 10 recap. The Tide goes down in Tiger Town. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at SEC Recap. Get all of our content at secrecap.com. You can check out our merch. We have awesome SEC Pride merch at bonfire.com/store/SEC Recap. It was a monumental week in the college football world. Let's get into it. Results from Week 10. Kentucky bounced back on the road against Mizzou in an ugly suck fest, winning 21-17. Florida made easy work of a decimated Texas A&M roster in College Station. The Gators won 41-24. Tennessee fell on the road in Athens in a heartbreaker 27-13, but Vols' playoff hopes still very much alive. Arkansas lost to Liberty at home 21-19 in a game that left Razorbacks fans stunned. Mississippi State hung on against Auburn in overtime as the Tigers put together a statement performance that unfortunately came up just short. And Vanderbilt and South Carolina said to hell with defense as both teams put up over 450 yards of total offense against one another. Gamecocks win 38-27. Now, the college football playoff rankings won't come out till Tuesday, but in the AP, there's been a little bit of shakeup. Georgia takes the number 1 spot still, followed by Ohio State, Michigan, TCU. Vols fall to number 5 in the AP. LSU will jump up to the number 7 spot, while Alabama falls to number 10, and right behind them, Ole Miss. Our SEC standings in the East: at the top sits Georgia, followed by Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, Florida, Mizzou, and Vanderbilt. And then in the West, LSU takes the number 1 spot, followed by Ole Miss, Alabama, Mississippi State, Arkansas, Auburn, and Texas A&M. Let's hit the huddle.
Come on, huddle up.
Starting with the noon slate of games, Kentucky at Mizzou. Last week, I called this a game that probably nobody wants to watch, and man, was it ugly. If you're an old school type of guy who just loves defense and as little scoring as possible, then you probably loved this mess. Kentucky had 252 total yards of offense to Mizzou's 232. Neither team broke 90 yards rushing. Both teams combined for 155 yards in penalties. Mizzou had 3 points until the fourth quarter. If you're looking for highlights from this game, there are none, but Kentucky gets the win 21-17. Over in College Station, Florida at Texas A&M. I initially thought Texas A&M had a chance in this one, and I picked them to win in a close one based on what we saw versus Ole Miss. But when news broke pregame that several key players for A&M were out due to illness, I immediately switched my pick to Florida by 10. Florida got loose in this game for 291 on the ground. Anthony Richardson averaged 11 yards a carry. Aggies had a pretty good day through the air, but Haynes King had to throw 45 passes to do it and only completed 23 of them for 279 yards. Florida completely controlled this game, and it probably gives them a lot of confidence as they get ready to host South Carolina, a game that would get the Gators bowl eligible with a win. In Athens, afternoon CBS game, Tennessee at Georgia. I'm not listing the rankings here because we're still waiting on the new college football playoff rankings. Most people were going by CFP, so if you are, it would have been number 1 Tennessee at number 3 Georgia. But if you're going by AP, it was number 1 Georgia, number 2 Tennessee. Regardless, Tennessee was an underdog coming into this game. There were a lot of factors that made it a long day for the Vols. But I do want to say this to Tennessee fans. The Vols are going to be okay. Tennessee football is just fine, and it's still in an amazing spot. They don't control their own destiny into the CFP any longer, but several pieces are still falling into place to get them there. Georgia and LSU will likely face off in the SEC championship, in which Georgia most likely boat races LSU. Again, this is a team that Tennessee beat by 28 points in their own stadium. That leaves the Vols as likely 11-1 and the best one-loss team in the country, with still one of the best resumes in the country. It benefits the Vols to have their only loss be to the SEC champion, who defeats the other team that Tennessee blew out in LSU. So I didn't really mean to do this, but let's talk about this a little bit more. So here's a plausible scenario that would all but guarantee Tennessee gets a spot in the top 4 when that final CFP poll comes out. So number 1, Tennessee just has to win out. They've got Mizzou, South Carolina, Vandy. Okay, you've just got to win out. You have to get 11-1. Style points are nice. Running up the score is nice. That gets you something. But the main goal is just to finish 11-1. Number 2, Ohio State needs to dominate Michigan in order to eliminate the 2 Big Ten schools' possibility from the CFP. Remember, Michigan was left out of the top 4. And instead, Clemson was in that 4 spot. So if Ohio State stomps Michigan into the ground, I'm not saying it will happen, but that would keep Ohio State in the top 4, and that would eliminate Michigan as that second big team, because neither Ohio State's nor Michigan's strength of schedule is good enough to put a one-loss non-Big Ten champion in the college football playoff over one-loss non-SEC champion Tennessee. Strength of schedule matters to the committee, and we've already seen that in those first rankings that came out. Number 3, this isn't a must, but it's a would be nice. TCU ideally needs to take a loss, perhaps to Texas, and or not win the Big 12 championship. Because the CFP committee initially valued Tennessee and Alabama ahead of TCU, with LSU beating Alabama and Tennessee having beaten both Alabama and LSU, it's unclear why the CFP committee would suddenly value TCU ahead of Tennessee. So I'm not expecting that, but then again, humans are by nature not logical. Number 4, Oregon ideally needs to take another loss, either regular season or in the Pac-12 championship. Again, in the committee's initial rankings, they valued Oregon behind Alabama, and now LSU could feasibly jump Alabama. I don't know that all of a sudden the committee's going to value anything Oregon has done as being better than what LSU has done. So I'm not expecting TCU and Oregon to take major steps. It's really more seeing how does the committee value or devalue Tennessee's loss to Georgia. So I think if 1, Tennessee winning out, plus a combination of 2 through 4 happen, then we most likely end up with a college football playoff top 4 that includes Georgia, Ohio State, Tennessee, and then possibly a TCU or Oregon at that 3rd spot. Again, I didn't really mean to get into college football playoff breakdown here, but the reason I would put Tennessee at the 3 instead of at the 4 is I don't think the committee will want that SEC rematch with Georgia 1, Tennessee 4. I think what would get the most eyeballs, the most ratings, the most engagement across the country would be a Tennessee, Ohio State, and then maybe Georgia, TCU. Again, I don't really see Oregon jumping into that top 4 unless they win out convincingly. And just as I don't think the committee would want a Tennessee-Georgia rematch in the semifinals, I also don't think they'll want a Georgia-Oregon rematch in the semifinals. All right, enough of that. Moving on. Liberty at Arkansas. Man, oh man. Last week I said that this is a game most SEC teams absolutely do not want to play late in the regular season, and now you see why. Liberty is a very good team. They've been in the AP top 25. They were left out of the CFP top 25. But this very game shows you why you don't want to play this game late in the season. You have nothing to gain and everything to lose. In this case, if you're Arkansas. I expected Arkansas's run game to be too much for Liberty. They ran for 144, but they only averaged 3.4 yards per carry. This ended up as a game where Arkansas was having to play from behind after Liberty was up 21-3 at the half. They held Liberty to no points in the second half, but when the biggest part of your offense is the run and the weakest part is the pass, it's not easy to play catch up, even if your defense is playing well. Okay, game of the day, game of the night, game of the week, game of the year, whatever you want to call it. Alabama at LSU. An absolute thrill ride in Death Valley as the Tigers upset the Tide in overtime, going for a gutsy 2-point conversion to seal the win 32-31. In my Game of the Week preview, I said one of the keys for LSU would be containing Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, containing Jahmyr Gibbs is relative because he's so talented, but holding him to under 100 yards would be considered containing Jahmyr Gibbs, and they did exactly that. They held him to under 100 yards on 15 carries. I also said that Jaden Daniels would be the key player for LSU, and he was phenomenal. 22 of 32 for 182 yards and 2 tutties, plus 18 carries for 95 yards and a tutty on the ground. LSU's defense only recorded 2 sacks to Alabama's 6, but they heavily affected Bryce Young, who is also phenomenal, by the way, with 10 QB hurries compared to 1 for Alabama's defense. LSU takes over at the top of the SEC West with the SEC title game completely within reach, but they'll most likely have to face Georgia, which could potentially make what Tennessee did to LSU look like a warm-up act. Auburn at Mississippi State. Robbie Ashford had a terrible day passing. 7 of 22 for 75 yards with an average depth of target of 3.4 yards. But he had a monster day on the ground. 18 for 108 and 2 tutties. Tank Bigsby also added 89 and a tutty. And I believe, I don't have it here in front of me, but Jarquez Hunter added a touchdown and 50 or 60 yards as well. Man, the ground game was going for Auburn. Defensively, both teams had good showings as far as sacks and tackles for loss, and neither team allowed more than 370 yards. Auburn battled back. Late in the third, fourth quarters, descended into OT, but ultimately Mississippi State got the win. Next week, though, Auburn gets a reeling Texas A&M at home, and it's the first game they're favored in more than 2 months. It's not going to be game of the week material for me, but I'll definitely be keeping an eye on that one. Mississippi State gets Georgia at home. And our final game of the evening, South Carolina at Vanderbilt. Despite not having Marshawn Lloyd available, South Carolina managed an 11-point victory over Vandy to get the Gamecocks bowl eligible. Both teams totaled over 200 yards rushing and 200 yards receiving in a game where defense was completely optional. It turns out that all Spencer Rattler needs to have a decent game is for there just to be no opposing defense on the field. I think the star of this game was Ray Davis, who totaled 167 on the ground on 20 carries and a receiving touchdown. And I think, if not for an early interception and a late interception, remember, Vandy had an interception, I think, on their opening drive and on their final drive. This game could have potentially gone Vandy's way, but them's the breaks in the SEC. All right, let's break down power rankings. Now, this week, I've reduced it to 3 tiers. The past few weeks, I've had 4. We've had the top tier, which is elite. The second tier, which was could beat you, but could also lose by double digits. Third tier was what you see is what you get. And then you have the bottom tier. Now, there's been very clear separation, at least over the last 2 to 3 weeks, from the teams at the top in the middle and the teams at the bottom in the middle, with just some slight movement. But when making these rankings this week, I noticed that there is very clear distinction at the top. There's very clear distinction at the bottom now, which kind of moves all of those teams in the middle together. So now I just have 3 tiers, and as always, I like to start from the bottom and work my way up to number 1. So starting at the bottom, number 14, yet again, unfortunately, Vanderbilt. They've got Kentucky, Florida, and Tennessee to end the year. Do I think they have a chance to improve to at least 1-7 in conference play by the end of the year? The Magic 8 Ball says no effing way. Number 13, Texas A&M. They're on a 5-game losing streak, which makes them the only other SEC team to share that company with Auburn and Vanderbilt. They're also the only other SEC team to have a 3-6 overall record that they also share with Auburn and Vanderbilt. I don't know where else you put the Aggies other than with Auburn and Vanderbilt. Which brings me to number 12, Auburn. I'm not certain even winning at Mississippi State could have pulled Auburn up much in this week's power rankings, but I think the bottom layers of sediment in this river of rankings have settled and are now cementing. I think it's pretty clear the 2, 3, maybe 4 teams at the bottom of the SEC. Number 11, South Carolina. I know Gamecocks fans are going to hate me, but I don't care. I maintain that South Carolina is one of the least impressive 6-3 teams. And look, both the AP and the coaches poll agree with me. The AP has South Carolina at number 34. The coaches poll has them at number 40. They're in the bottom third in the SEC in both total offense and total defense. And I don't see that rapidly changing in the last 3 weeks of the season. They've got Florida, who's just coming off of a win. They've got Tennessee and Clemson. That's a tough row to hoe in the back stretch. Look, if you're in the bottom third in the SEC in offense and defense, that is probably going to correlate with being in the bottom third of the SEC in your power rankings. Number 10, Missouri. I didn't expect Mizzou to beat Kentucky, but suddenly the Arkansas game looks really gettable for the Tigers. I think 6-6 is very much possible. However, Mizzou is not a good team. They have an okay defense. They do not have a good offense. So Mizzou is going to round out the top of my third tier. These are teams that just aren't scaring anyone. Moving up into the second tier, number 9, Arkansas. Any day you run for 144 and throw for almost 300, you should absolutely win, in my opinion. Apparently, unless you're Arkansas. Now, Liberty is a very good team, and as I said before, this is a game that most SEC coaches do not want to play late in the season because you have nothing to gain from it. Now the Hogs have to play LSU and Ole Miss before going to Missouri. Missouri might be their only real chance to get 6-6, and I don't feel super confident about it. Hogs are really close to the bottom tier here in the SEC. Moving on up, number 8, Florida. South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Florida State. That's who Florida plays the last 3 games of the season. I think the Gators can get 2 out of those 3 and improve to 7-5 on the year. Now, they could get all 3. They're definitely capable of beating South Carolina. They're definitely capable of beating Vanderbilt, and they're certainly capable of beating Florida State. So if they can get to 7-5, possibly 8-4, that is totally acceptable for year 1 under Napier. I know Florida fans don't like that. They expect more, and that's fair. But recall, Josh Heupel up at Tennessee went 7-5 in year 1. They could finish 11-1 this year. My point is you have to start somewhere They've had a lot of coaching turnover in the last decade. I think 7-5, 8-4 is a big win for the Gators this season. Number 7. Now, I removed my what you see is what you get tier this week because most of these middle teams are just that. They're mid. They could all beat each other for the rest of the season, and it wouldn't really impact the teams at the top. Mississippi State, not a lot to say here. They're just another team in the middle. Number 6, Kentucky. I do think Kentucky, with their starters, is better than most other teams in this tier. But they're still capable of taking an L from just about any one of them, and their margins of victory just aren't inspiring. 4 points over Missouri? Yeah, no. Finally, at the top of my second tier, kind of on the cusp here, Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a weird one. Their 8-1 record suggests that they should be in that top tier, that elite tier. But their on-field performance and margin of victory suggests that they're just a couple plays away from 6-3. I think about Ole Miss the same way I think about South Carolina. There's a few games you can point to and some weird things where if just a couple plays go differently, you're not sitting at your current record. And I think Ole Miss is just a couple plays away from being 6-3. For this, I currently have them at the top of the middle. Now, they still have to play Alabama. They could prove themselves against Alabama. They could maybe knock Alabama out of that top tier and move into that top tier themselves. But a 3-point win versus a bad Texas A&M team, a really close win at home over not a great Kentucky team, that's not elite play. For that, I'm keeping them in the second tier. Moving up into the top tier, still elite at number 4, Alabama. Alabama is one of, if not the best, 2-loss team in the country. I think they still might be better than LSU on a neutral field. But you got to play the games where the games are played, and Alabama took the L in Baton Rouge at Death Valley to LSU. For that reason, at number 3 this week, LSU. The Tigers have now basically won the SEC West. They've just got to win out. It's in their control. They have Arkansas, UAB, and Texas A&M left. The SEC West is LSU's to lose. Coming in at number 2 this week, Tennessee. Look, Tennessee has enjoyed a stretch at number 1 for a few weeks now, but they dropped to number 2 here for obvious reasons. They still have Mizzou, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt to end the season. Aside from style points, there's not a whole lot Tennessee can do to really improve their resume. They just got to finish out and make sure they get to 11-1 when the season's over. Finally, back at number 1. It's been a few weeks, but they left no doubt. Georgia retaking the number 1 spot and the SEC East title as long as they finish the season strong. They go to Mississippi State and to Kentucky before playing Georgia Tech, but I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell they lose any of those games. That's going to do it for today's show. Thank you for listening to the SEC Recap Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Warren. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at SEC Recap. If you're listening in audio form, go to Spotify, go to Apple, leave us a rating and review. It helps us grow the show. If you're listening on YouTube, smash that like, smash that thumbs up button, and sub to the channel. We're trying to get to 100 subs. You guys are awesome. I want to do a lot more on YouTube, and you make that possible. Again, check out our merch. We've got awesome, really sweet looking SEC Pride merch. I've got some ordered for myself for all 14 SEC teams. Go to bonfire.com/store/SEC recap. Check that out, guys. Thank you again. Have a great week. It's great to be in the SEC right here on the SEC Recap.